Okay. Uh, Grace and law are not to be confused. Okay. It is faith that makes it possible for God to save sinners by His grace. If salvation is by grace, then it is by works. Otherwise, grace is no more grace. It tells us in Romans 11, verse 6. If salvation of works, we're going to be saved by works, then it is no more grace. Otherwise, work is no more work. Romans 11, verse 6. And Romans 4, verse 4 tells us that if one works for salvation, then the reward is not reckoned of grace, but debt. And Romans chapter 4, verse 5 tells us that if one does not work, but believes on Christ that justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness in Romans 4, 5, as I said before. And if inheritance is of the law, then it is no more a promise. But God gave it to Abraham by promise in Galatians 3, verses 16 through 18. And Paul tells us in Romans that sin shall not have dominion over believers, and believers are not under the law, but under grace. Romans 6, verse 14. And then Romans 6, verse 15 says, "What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law? God forbid." And Romans 8, verse 4 tells us that the righteousness of the law is fulfilled in those who walk after the Spirit. It is grace that motivates believers and teaches believers to maintain good works. Grace teaches us to deny ungodliness and worldly lust and to live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. And that's in Titus 2, verses 11 through 12. So how many of us are sinners? Paul says we're all sinners in Romans 3:23. And then in Romans 6:23, we see that the wages of sin is death. So by sinning, we earn death, which in this case is the second death. And the second death is an eternal separation from God in a lake of fire. The first death is our physical death, which is the separation of the spirit and soul from the body. The body goes to the grave, and the spirit and soul of the believer go to heaven, with the unbelievers going to hell. For those who are sent to hell, there is a resurrection and a judgment at the great white throne for degrees of punishment. And these unbelievers will be cast into the lake of fire to be there forever, and that's the second death. And that's mentioned in Revelation chapter 21, verse 8. So clearly, we cannot be eternally separated from God and go to heaven. However, when we accept what Christ did for us on the cross, we are buried with him into death and raised from the dead by the glory of the Father. And now we should walk in newness of life. Romans chapter 6, verse 4. Our old man was crucified with Christ, that our body of sin might be destroyed and that we should now not serve sin. We are considered dead and are free from sin, according to Romans 6, verses 5 through 7. So Christ paid for our sins by dying on the cross in our place. And now we are no longer under the curse of the second death. And that's according to Revelation chapter 2, verse 11, and chapter 20, verse 6. And I thank you for listening.